have our afternoon fireside chat. And these two really don't even need much introduction, so I can almost drop the mic and walk off stage. But I'll say I want to welcome to the stage Anne Finucane, who is the Vice Chair of Bank of America and has been one of our very great supporters of HubWeek since the beginning. So we really want to give Anne a very warm thanks, as well as a welcome to the stage. And of course, our former Senator of the great state of Massachusetts, John Kerry. So John and Anne, welcome to the stage, please.
Hello, everybody. John, for being here. Going on that you'd care about?
Nothing happening in the world. It's quiet.
Happening in the world. Actually, there's so much to talk about.
Have you seen Eminem's latest rap?
No.
Worth it. That's my editorial comment.
Well, I don't know where to start. The concerns around North Korea, or that President Trump just signed executive orders, I don't know what you want to call it, relaxing the health insurance reforms, or NAFTA seems less certain than it was just a little while ago. But really, I think maybe we should be talking about Iran. Obviously, tomorrow, rumor is that he'll decertify. And for those of us that are not in the know, and all we do is read, it's a little uncertain what that means. What does it mean to decertify in Iran? And what does it mean when our European allies and even Ehud Barak, from former Prime Minister of Israel, is encouraging us to stay in? What does this mean? And then what happens when you decertify?
Well, Anne, first of all, let me say it's a pleasure to be here with everybody at HubWeek. And it's important to take a moment to think about the meaning of this potential Iran decertification. Just so everybody has context of what this means. When I started and sat down negotiating with the foreign minister of Iran, on that day in September of 2013, Iran had about a 2-month breakout period to break out to get a nuclear weapon. They had 12,000 kilograms of enriched uranium to use to make bombs. That's enough for 10 to 12 bombs. And they had gone from 5,000 to 19,000 working centrifuges that were spinning and creating enriched uranium. And they had a plutonium reactor that made plutonium weapons grade material that could have produced 2 a month, 2 a year, and they were rushing to the commissioning of that plant. And we were being urged by every leader I met with, President of Egypt, then Mubarak, the King of Saudi Arabia, then Abdullah, the Prime Minister of Israel, still Netanyahu, were all urging us to bomb Iran. Literally, the President Obama, was getting personal requests that we should be bombing Iran. And we engaged in diplomacy. Not because we knew it would definitely work, but because we knew we had to exhaust the remedies of diplomacy before you went to war. So I met with my foreign minister counterpart in September of 2013, and by November, we worked out a framework agreement, just a framework, where Iran stopped enriching at the rate it was, froze its program, and we, in a good faith sign to show them that they could have value in doing that, lifted a few of the sanctions and told them that more can happen if we get where we need to go. For the next 2 years, we negotiated 159 pages of extremely detailed requirements of who does what. And guess what? The 19,000 centrifuges went down to less than 5,000 working, limited to the old generation. They can't deploy any new ones. The stockpile of 12,000 kilograms went down to 300 kilograms. You cannot physically make a bomb with 300 kilograms. The Arak plutonium reactor was physically destroyed. Concrete put into the center of the core of the reactor, so it cannot be commissioned, it cannot be used. The centrifuges went to less than 5,000. They were not allowed to do any enrichment underground or out of sight. And ultimately, we created an agreement where they have the most stringent, exhaustive accountability day to day of their program than any country in the world. We put an additional 130 inspectors into Iran. They live there. Every day they look at what's happening to the enrichment. Every day they're checking on Iran's performance. And over 8 different times, the International Atomic Energy Commission has said Iran is living up to the deal. Congress, as a means of inserting itself into the process, passed a law saying the president has to certify every 3 months that, number one, Iran is in compliance, and number two, that this is in the national security interest of the United States to keep the deal. So all of a sudden, out of the blue, without any facts to support it, without any showing that they're not in compliance. On the contrary, with Ehud Barak, the former defense minister, chief of staff, and prime minister of Israel, saying we should keep the deal, they're in compliance. Without any IAEA, International Atomic Energy, saying that they're not in compliance, President Trump is just pulling out of the sky the notion that he is going to decertify because he, quote, doesn't like the deal. Because he's been out there telling people this is the worst deal and so on and so forth.
But John, he thinks that he can cut a better deal. I mean,
Let me be very clear about the better deal. The Bush administration tried for 8 years to have a deal with no enrichment at all. That's what they say when they talk about a better deal. I know for a fact that 2 to 3 highest level officials of the Bush administration, I'm not going to name them simply because I haven't asked them, but they have both told me to my face they decided that they needed to cut a deal with Iran as towards the end of their administration where they're allowed a certain amount, there's some enrichment. They have to be able to enrich. And the answer is yes, they can enrich, but so do 13 other nations. And you would not have a deal. There would be no agreement to roll back their program because to have asked them not to do that would have meant that they can't be self-sufficient in the provision of their own fuel for their own peaceful nuclear program. And we have a means called the additional protocol of the IAEA procedure whereby we can do a challenge inspection at any time. In other words, if we have cause to believe Iran is breaking the deal and moving to enrich in some hidden facility, we have a right to challenge and to go inspect that facility. And if Iran doesn't allow us to inspect it, we built in a procedure where there's 6 countries, Russia, China, the United States, United Kingdom, France, and Germany, all come together and we vote. And if there's a majority vote to go inspect, those countries have to support that and be willing to go to the United Nations and support an international resolution to do this. So we have the most intrusive inspection and accountability system set up on any nation, anywhere on the planet. And no nation thus far subject to the additional protocol, has been able to go nuclear. So why were we comfortable passing this deal? Because we knew that we would know if Iran was ticking up its uranium enrichment, folks. I mean, listen to what we got. And the administration is lying to the American people, putting it bluntly, telling them, well, the whole thing sunsets in 10 years or 15. No, it doesn't. There's a provision that sunsets in 10 years. There's a provision that sunsets in 15 years, and in 20 years, and in 25 years. But the agreement, including the additional protocol with the right to challenge, is lifetime. It's forever. So if they ever decided they're going to try to break out, we will know instantaneously that they are ticking up the enrichment, that they're starting to do something because of the inspections, and every single option that is available to us today is available to us then. So if you're hunkering for a war, if that's what you want, you can have your war in 15 years. You can have your war in 20 years if you have justification and a reason to tell the world this is what you need to do. But there is no rationale whatsoever, no excuse. It is reckless, it is dangerous, it is irresponsible for the United States of America, the proponent of this agreement, the chief negotiator of this agreement, to turn around under a new president and say, I don't like it, we're going to get out, when there's no rationale for doing so. And then what you do, you make 25 years and 20 years and 15 years and 10 years all happen tomorrow. You move everything forward. So instead of seeing if Iran will change, instead of seeing if you can build the support around the world for what you may have to do, the United States would potentially isolate itself. That's the result. And when we need the support of these other nations, if we needed to, in order to enforce what we have then walked away from, you think those countries are going to be there? Yesterday, I briefed the United States House of Representatives Democratic Caucus, and we had the ambassadors from Germany, France, and Britain there, and we had the EU ambassador. And every single one of them said to the members of Congress, if President Trump decides to decertify, we will not follow the United States. We will keep this agreement. That means Russia, China, three other countries are going to keep this agreement. And what I strongly recommend to Iran, to China, to Russia, is that their leaders be the adults in the room, together with Britain and France and Germany, and that all of them together say, we are going to keep this agreement because it makes the world safer. And we are not going to follow the example of Donald Trump, just as the majority of the governors and mayors of America are not following the example of this president who pulled out of Paris. The president may pull out of Paris, but the American people are not pulling out of Paris, and the same thing should happen now.
We'll get to Paris in a minute. But
can't get to Paris fast enough. Anyway.
Nonetheless, just to complete the thought on Iran for the lay people of us here.
By the way, can I just insert one thing, one minute? Iran, and think of Iran and the impact on North Korea. Here we are with a really major nuclear challenge with North Korea. Very, very dangerous, genuine threat. Do you think when the President of the United States unilaterally decides to change an agreement and pull out of it internationally, and the 6 other countries involved in it say, no, we're staying with it, what's the message to Kim Jong-un and North Korea about trust and making a deal with the United States? When the president went to the UN security, and he went to the UN, and he stood up and said, I'll destroy your country, and now talking about getting out of the deal, he is giving Kim Jong-un a reason to try to have a nuclear weapon. This is really reckless, dangerous, and non-strategic. And that's what people need to focus on.
I do not mean to pour salt in the wound, but if tomorrow President does decertify and it goes to Congress to then pass sanctions, what do you think the likelihood of that is?
Well, I think Congress is going to have a very difficult time deciding. I think that I'm told, I didn't read the statement, but I'm told that the chairman of the House, the Foreign Affairs Committee, Chairman Royce, said that he didn't think we should get out of it. I will tell you straightforwardly that besides Ehud Barak, the former prime minister, I am told that the heads of the security entities of Israel, Shin Bet, Mossad, the Israeli Defense Forces, believe this deal is working and that Israel is safer with this deal in place. So I think I think over time, as it settles in, my hope and prayer is that Congress will also join the adults in the room and be responsible about how to approach Iran. Now, Iran creates problems, obviously, in certain endeavors. We all know that. This is why we kept the sanctions. We kept the sanctions on embargo of weapons. We kept the sanctions on missiles. We kept the sanctions on human rights. And we have increased those sanctions since the deal was made. So we've been willing to employ them. But here's the other downside of what the president is doing. By attacking the Iran deal, and by now, if he moves to decertify, by creating instability in it, and by joining with a group of senators who have been attacking it since the beginning, who say they want to destroy it, what he's done is he's polluted the water. So that if you want to bring a legitimate initiative with respect to missiles or arms embargo, Iran is going to interpret that as a backdoor effort to kill the deal, rather than a legitimate effort to hold them accountable for what they should be held accountable for. And the result of that will be that it's actually strategically restricted the scope with which we can operate here. It's limited the United States' ability to do the other things we want to do unless you take the higher risk that you're going to confuse Iran. Now, why is this important? Because Iran has its own political challenges, folks. There are hardliners in Iran who hated this deal. They wanted a nuclear umbrella for Iran. The IRGC, other actors. And for President Rouhani and those who are trying to change the relationship with the world and lift sanctions and do business with the world, this makes their political life miserable and difficult. And ultimately, if the hardliners are so empowered by the threats of President Trump, you get into a vicious cycle of a downward spiral towards confrontation. And then the politics of Iran become even that much more complicated. So it's important in diplomacy and important in these relationships that you really make judgments about who you're dealing with and what their life is like. When I announced when the Iranians and us stood up in Lausanne and we announced the framework that we had reached, which was extremely detailed, in the middle of the negotiation, I knew we were going to make their life miserable and our lives miserable by making that announcement. Why? Because it would invite the opposition of people who didn't like the deal with the knowledge that we were really close to making one. And that's exactly what happened. The foreign minister of Iran had death threats at home because it showed that they were giving up part of their program in an effort to comply. You think that was easy in Iran? No more easy than our efforts to try to hold back some of the Congress that wanted to put new sanctions in place. And the reason we had to make that mid-announcement was because Congress was about to pass sanctions, and the only way we could stop them from doing it was to show them we were making progress, and if they did so, they would actually stop what was happening. So every action has a counter-reaction. It's normal. It's not just physics. It's politics and diplomacy. And whatever begins to happen tomorrow moves in a less stable direction than simply enforcing this agreement and trying to move to a different paradigm in the Middle East, which is what we need.
Okay, let's pivot here, shall we, to Paris. But before we get to Paris, everything you've said is sort of an advertisement for those of us not in government to recognize that something other than government needs to participate in moving the world forward. And we as a big business, Bank of America, are among those companies that believe that we need to deploy capital and people into helping solve these issues. So as you know, and in full disclosure, John is signed on as the chairman of our Global Advisory Council, which are leaders largely in business from around the world that he has just agreed to chair. But in deploying capital, now you know we have a big commitment in the environment. We've put in $70 billion over the last 10 years. Most of that is in the last 3 years. 10 years ago, we probably did multiples in coal than we did in renewables. Today, our renewables are 10 times what we do in coal. Same with water, affordable housing. These are the kinds of things that business and government can work together. And I think we all felt very energized during the the Paris Agreement, COP21. Almost 200 countries, many companies, nearly as many more companies there to begin a process of reducing our carbon footprint. So despite the fact that, once again, President Trump has indicated his lack of support for it, I'm interested what you think. First of all, once again, it's another place you put so much of your energy, great success. But don't you see that a little differently in so much as companies have now just stayed the course and countries are staying the course?
Well, more than that, first of all, let me just say, in full disclosure also, I'm delighted to be involved in this international global advisory group for the Bank of America, because Bank of America has made a unique contribution to this effort by committing $125 billion to alternative, renewable, sustainable energy, and a catalytic fund of some $10 billion to try to leverage change in the world. And I've been involved in this issue. It's a tremendous effort. And I cannot tell you how critical that is. I led the negotiations on the Paris Agreement. I went to China within weeks of being confirmed as Secretary of State, and I negotiated with the Chinese because I saw the failure in Copenhagen. And I said, you know, we've got another global meeting coming up. We can't afford to fail. And I knew the Chinese were key to it because in Copenhagen, the Chinese were opposed to what we were trying to do. And President Obama famously crashed a meeting at the end trying to persuade them to come the other way. So I went to China. We created this working group with President Xi and the Chinese. And 1 year later, President Obama was able to stand up with President Xi in Beijing and announce that the United States and China were going to lead the world as the two largest emitters of greenhouse gases in the world. They were going to go to Paris and make an agreement happen. And that's really what happened. It broke the logjam. It opened up the possibility. Now, as I said in Paris moments after the agreement was gavelled to a close, we didn't leave Paris believing we had achieved the goal of keeping the Earth's temperature to a guarantee of no more than 2 degrees centigrade increase. We knew we weren't doing that. What we knew, because we couldn't do that. because too many countries are unwilling to accept a mandatory target. So once again, President Trump has lied to America about why he pulled out of Paris, because he said to America, Paris forced a burden on the United States that's too great. No, it did not. No burden was forced on the United States or any other country by Paris. Every country accepted a voluntary target. And all the president had to do was say, I don't like the target, I'm going to change it. He didn't have to stand up and make this phony move of, we got to pull out. By the way, the pullout is not effective under the law until the day after the election of 2020. So stay tuned. That's important.
But John.
But let me just finish the thought. But here's what happened in Paris. What we knew we were doing was sending the world a message that 196 countries were all committed to move in the same direction. And that, we said, is going to unleash a torrent of investment. Last year, for the first time in human history, more money was invested, $358 billion, was invested in alternative and renewable energy than was invested in fossil fuel energy for the first time. That's the movement. That was exactly what we wanted to have happen. And today, solar energy, wind energy are literally true cost for true cost competitive with coal, better than coal. And if you did an honest accounting of coal, which nobody does, nobody accounts for coal sludge. Nobody accounts for emphysema or for kids who have, environmentally induced asthma during the summer. We spend about $55 billion in America on hospitalization for children during the summer. Did you know that? It's hugely expensive. That cost never gets put into the real cost of coal, but that's coal. So if you take the real costs, alternative renewable is so much better. And now in America, renewable energy is moving far faster than any other. The fastest growing job in America, wind turbine technician. And today, solar is much more efficient, much lower cost, and we're able to do distributive power. So this is happening, folks. And unfortunately, the Trump administration is trying to move America backwards, away from the future. The future is in a clean energy paradigm, because that is the only way that you can solve the problem of climate change. The solution to climate change is energy policy. And it's there waiting for us to grab it. And by the way, it's the biggest market the world has ever seen. We're at, today, we're at about 7 billion people. We're going to go up to about 9 billion people, maybe 10 by 2100, but 9 billion by about the middle of the century. About 4 to 5 billion users today on energy, so you have huge growth. And this state understands better than anybody what it meant to make money on technology in the 1990s. We had a lot of people become wealthier than ever before in American history. That was a $1 trillion market with 1 billion users. Energy is going to be a 9 billion user, largest market in human history. And Donald Trump is walking away from it. So I think there's a very clear future here, Ann. And here's the conclusion I came to after 28 years in the Senate and 4 as Secretary of State. No government in the world is going to move fast enough to deal with this problem and the other problems that we face. It is going to take the private sector stepping up and bringing private capital to the table to do what we need to do to meet the global challenges of today. And I am convinced of that. And that's why I'm trying to work to create ways of bringing $12 to $13 trillion that's sitting in net negative interest status around the world off the sidelines and get it into the investments in water, in transportation, in energy, all of which have a revenue stream, which means you can make money investing in those deals. And that's why I'm involved with the bank, because I think Bank of America is helping to lead countries and companies to this new paradigm, which is what we have to get to faster than anything we've ever done before in order to literally survive. And you look at what's happening in California today. Why are these fires burning the way they're burning? Increased vegetation that comes from increased rainfall, that comes from increased heat, increased cycle over the ocean, which is warmer, putting more moisture into the air. That's why we have more floods than we've had before. And the droughts of the last years, which come from the warmest years in human history, last decade warmest, one before it, second warmest, one before that, third warmest. Most reasonable thinking people would draw a conclusion from that alone. Something's going on. And when the scientists tell us we know what's going on, it's climate change because of human-induced change in the atmosphere, we better listen. And private sector is going to be critical to making this happen.
We're happy to hear it. We're the largest underwriter of green bonds in the world, so more of it is good. John, we only have a few minutes, so I thought that I would move to another part of the world in terms of diplomacy and ask you your thoughts on Brexit and how that is going to play out for the UK to the US and the UK to Europe.
And the final was what?
UK to Europe and the UK to the US. It's very bad acoustics up here. I hope you can hear us.
Can you all hear okay?
Yeah, good.
Good. We're sort of in an echo chamber up here. It's weird. Well, I'm not in office anymore, and I'm not serving for a president, so I can be pretty blunt about this.
And you haven't been to date?
What?
You haven't been so far?
No, I've been blunt. I'm in blunt mode. I think Brexit is one of the most wrong-headed things I've ever heard of, and I think it's going to do enormous damage to Great Britain and to Europe. And I think that they're dreaming if they think they're going to get the kind of deal they want to get and pretend they need to get, because to have a single market access, the European countries can't cave in on what has created the EU, and they can't cave in on the issue of the movement of people, which is what Britain wants. So how you get a deal that helps Britain, honestly, I just don't see it happening. I've talked very closely with the finance ministers and the foreign ministers and the prime ministers of these countries, and I think it's going to be very difficult. But here's the reason why I think it's so wrong-headed. We have a problem still with what Russia is doing in Ukraine. We have serious challenges with extremism. We have a vast challenge with the movement, migratory people. Africa, you've got 2 billion children between 15, well, not all children, but 15 to 24. 2 billion of them in the world. The largest proportion of them are in Northern Africa and in the Middle East and South Central Asia. That's where you have the most extremism. You have 1.8 billion children 15 years or younger. I had dinner with a foreign minister in a North African country whom I like and who I think is very intelligent. And I'm not going to tell you the country, but we went out to dinner. And I said to him, you know, you've got a 40% minority Muslim country. How do you manage this challenge of extremism? And he said, John, we're terrified. He said, the extremists grab these kids when they're 12 and 13 and 14 years old. And they take them away from their families, they pay them a stipend, they proselytize to them. And then when they're fully indoctrinated, those kids go out and become the recruiters. And here's the money load sentence that he said to me. He said, John, these guys have a 35-year plan. We don't even have a 5-year plan. Now, I want you to think about that. We have climate change, we have Iran, we have nuclear weapons, we have extremism, we have failed states at larger numbers. We have huge challenges. I'm frankly extremely optimistic, despite all that, about our ability to forge through this, but not if we're wasting our energy undoing and doing something that is, frankly, as non-productive as what is happening in Brexit in Europe. All the energy of those governments is not going into dealing with that extremism or building the global response to this challenge of 400 million children who will never go to school in those regions. This is a time when we need a modern-day Marshall Plan, 21st century, not dependent on government money, but on private sector organization coming in and providing jobs and building infrastructure, doing the things necessary to create stability in the world. And yet what's happening? The EU, the most important experiment in the West with respect to post-World War II stability, is being challenged and potentially unraveled depending on what happens, though I think Europe now is actually stronger than it was before that process began, which may be a message to Great Britain and to the Brexiters, the leavers. But I'd rather have seen a reform effort take place in Brussels and Strasbourg, because it needs reform, and build strength towards dealing with these other problems than see the thing pulling apart. And you'll notice President Xi and President Putin working overtime to drive a wedge, using Brexit as a means of weakening the Western alliance and trying to point the failures of democracy as a consequence. So I think it's a big, strategic loss. And to me, that just is not a sensible way to be approaching the challenges of this dawn of the 21st century.
And yet you know that the Europeans, for maybe the first time, truly feel that they've got to collect themselves as the EU and not go it alone, but really assert themselves.
Correct. But I think you're seeing President Macron and Angela Merkel, and you saw what happened in the results of that election with the 13 seats that went to the alternative right. There's some real challenges, folks, in all of this. By the way, our politics are related to all of this, too. I totally understand the anger. I share the anger. I don't know how all of you feel, but I think people on the right, people on the left, people in the center ought to all be angry because government isn't working. And it isn't working because it's not delivering what people have a right to expect on any side of the ledger. Think about it. People are working harder, they're making less, they're not improving their lives. They see the privileged, the sort of elite component of it that seems to be getting away with everything, and they don't get the same rules applied. I understand that anger. We still don't have tax reform. We need tax reform in America. Why we have 60, 70, 80,000 pages of tax code? How many of you have your own page in the tax code? Anybody here got your own page? Well, we got a lot of people in America who do. A lot of companies have their own pages. And it comes at the expense of a fair distribution of income to a whole bunch of people in this nation. So if we don't change that here too, we're going to see ourselves diverted as we are. No, we're not. We're going to. Excuse me, I'm misspeaking. We are being diverted today ourselves as a consequence of our inattention to making our own democracy work properly. And the two biggest reasons our democracy doesn't work properly, one, the amount of money in American politics because of Citizens United, and number two, the incredible, wrongful gerrymandering of a United States Congress so we can't have a fair democratic election in America.
John. We only have you for another 2 minutes. And
listen, when I was a senator, they didn't groan when I left.
We are enormously grateful for your service to the country, both as for everything, for your service as in the military, as a lieutenant governor, as a senator, as our nominee, the Democratic nominee for president, for the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, and for the Secretary of State. So in this very little time that we have left, I thought if you could there was another time in this country that we were in turmoil and extreme chaos, if you will, and that was in the late 60s during the Vietnam War. We've just finished up a terrific series with Ken Burns of 18 Hours of the Vietnam War. You are featured in it. You don't speak in it, but you're featured in it. As what can you reflect that time to this time?
Well, look, first of all, I don't know how many of you have seen Ken Burns' work, but he does a brilliant job, and Bank of America, again, has stepped up and sponsored this. I mean, they've done an amazing job.
Imagine that.
So. But let me tell you what I want to put it in a context, because I think there is a context. And Ann didn't tip me off; she was going to ask me this, but I've given you a lot of the problems. I've sat here and I've said, look, we've got these challenges, and they're tough. But I think that film and that period of time tell me we can get through all of this. I think one of the messages of that film underneath is that our institutions that our forefathers put together survive. They're really strong. They're a lot stronger than people think. And even that time when we had Black Panthers and bombings in various places and assassinations, Bobby Kennedy, Medgar Evers, Martin Luther King, Jack Kennedy beginning the sort of curve in 1963, massive upheaval culturally, revolution in some ways, certainly 1968, 69, the horrible ending of the war, the deception, Richard Nixon, Watergate. I mean, when I think about my years at college, my freshman year, we almost went to war over Cuba and missiles. My sophomore year, President Kennedy was assassinated. My junior year, we had the civil rights movement, and people were killed, and churches blew up. And my senior year was Vietnam, and a bunch of families were pitted against each other, and brothers fought against each other, and fathers and sons were separated, and kids went to Canada and went to jail. Think about it. We survived it. We came out of Watergate. We had the environment movements. One of the first things I was involved in was Earth Day. 20 million people came out of their homes and said, we're not going to live next to Woburn waste sites and water that makes us sick and gives us cancer. So guess what? We targeted 12 of the worst people in the Congress, called them the Dirty Dozen, and 7 of the 12 were beaten in the 1972 election, and that's how we got a Clean Air Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, Marine Mammal Protection, Coastal Zone Management. That's how we got the EPA and put it into existence. We made it happen. And the message is, we made those things voting issues. Now, about today, here's why I'm an optimist. Because we are doing unbelievable things with technology. Yeah, it's scary to some people. And you have AI coming down the road. But folks, in the 1900s, you know what the population was of America that was in agriculture? 50%. You know what it is today? 1.5%, 2%. All those people went off and did different things. We do different things. We did the same thing with Lowell and Lawrence and Springfield and Holyoke and places in our state, which had those old mills and planned cities, and we transitioned. Now, we're in a huge transition now, and it's the purpose and objective of people in public life to make sure that we're moving in a way that we create enough of those jobs for the future. But guess what? 400 million people have come out of poverty in China, 400 million or so in India. If you're a woman in the world today and you're pregnant, you're 50% more likely to live in birth, and your child is 50% more likely to be fed and go to school. We took Ebola. We were told 1 million people are going to die between September and December, by Christmas. Well, no. President Obama had the courage to send 3,000 troops to West Africa. We didn't know what we didn't know, but we knew we had to try to build healthcare delivery capacity. We did it, and we had a tiny fraction of that 1 million prediction die, and we stopped Ebola in its tracks. We're on the brunt of having the first generation of children will be born in Africa AIDS-free because of you, because of the United States of America. We did that. And when you look at what we did in Ukraine, yeah, Crimea is terrible. It's an abuse of everything we've worked against since World War II. But by putting sanctions together, by organizing Europe, we were able to send a message to Putin, this is going to be costly. And we stopped him from going to Kiev. We made it clear with the reassurance of Western Europe that we're going to stand up for values and principles. I can run a long list of things, folks, that show me how life is better for people, broader, and life is longer, they're living better, making more, I mean, think about it. If we will apply ourselves with the energy of our democracy to the task of setting the right priorities, rebuilding our country, doing some genuine infrastructure projects. The last big one I can think of in America was right here, the Big Dig. Jerry Brown's trying to build a high-speed rail out in California, but can you name any great infrastructure project in America today? And yet we have an Acela train that goes 155 miles an hour for only 18 miles of the entire trip from Washington to New York. What? Go figure. The United States of America, I rode on a train that goes 300 miles an hour from Beijing to the coast of China, and the attendant put water on my table, and it didn't even move while we were going 300 miles an hour. Try that on the Acela, folks. So all I can say to you is there's a huge agenda. There's a nation to rebuild. There are jobs to be done, educating, taking care of people, building, doing things. We shouldn't be scared. We should be confident. We should just make the right choices for what we need to do. And that's what we have to make happen as we go forward in our elections and our democracy.
Thank you, John. Thank you to the optimists. Thank you, HubWeek.